Hello, Jake, and thank you for allowing me to share my ideas with you as you seek to help your client. I'd like to suggest to you a method that perhaps is rooted more in my expertise in pastoral care storytelling. As I read the story of your client, I could not but think of stories that show some resemblance to their situation from the scripture. As far as I noticed, your client is a devoted Christian. Being a Christian is the main reason why she chose you as a counselor in the first place. So I assume your client is not only open to having the scriptures present in your counseling process, but would likely benefit and desire to have a scriptures informed counseling process. I know there are some limitations that might make you nervous being in a clinical context, but research has shown that clients are in fact much more desirous to have faith integrated in the helping process than you may expect. I believe your client would have no objection to have their faith integrated into the counseling sessions, so I encourage you to ask them about it. If their answer is negative, this presentation might not help you too much, except for perhaps future favorable counseling circumstances. But if their answer is indeed positive, I believe your client can benefit from this method of interactive storytelling where the story of your client mingles with stories from scripture that are relatable. Here's what I propose. Our ultimate purpose is to instill hope into the client. We also argue that truthful hope creates rapport and motivates change. And how do we achieve all this? One way to instill hope is using interactive storytelling. By interactive storytelling, I imagine a both ways street connecting your client's story with a similar story in the scriptures in a process of continuous dialogue with the text and transformative hope instilling empathy with the characters. I like to suggest to you a quote I found meaningful. Our lives are ceaselessly intertwined with narrative, with the stories we tell and hear told, those we dream or imagine or would like to tell, all of which are reworked in the story of our own lives that we narrate to ourselves. End quote. Or, in Cohen's words, the Bible is a book about ancient figures who were endowed with a meta universality that goes beyond their epochs and regions. With proper insight, we find that they reflect timeless human characteristics and points of contact with the psychological, familial, and communal concerns of modern times. End quote. Research has shown that the use of storytelling in counseling can strengthen the therapeutic bond and catalyze change. End quote. Even more, biblical narratives stimulate the imagination in such a way that begins to locate one's story in the larger meta-narrative context of the history of God's interaction with the human race. End quote. By connecting your client's story to an appropriate biblical story, you can provide the opportunity for your client to empathize with the biblical characters and gain a new, more truthful perspectives that connect their faith with their present circumstances and find hopeful points of relatedness. I'd like to suggest a few biblical stories that you may use with your client. My approach in coming alongside you in the helping process of your client has been shaped by a number of themes that I consider foundational to your client's situation and life experience. First, I notice that the client is dedicated to their Christian faith, even though their faith is not shared in the family. Second, I notice the client is part of an ethnic minority. Third, I realize that the client's presenting situation of divorce has its roots in a years long dysfunctional marriage predicament of loneliness, abandonment, and betrayal. Fourth, I could observe that the client's perspective on life is significantly impacted by inward guilt and a spirit of duty, and outward vocational service and voluntary caregiving. Fifth, I note the client's withdrawal from social life, thus being prone to self isolation, lacking a network of support. Sixth, The client seems to be stuck in a complex situation composed both by factors that are outside of and that are potentially under her control. Finally, I understand that the client's present outlook on life is depressive, passive resigning, at times distorted, and overall hopeless. Even though both their vocation in social work and her compassionate volunteer work brought them appreciation from the outside, the client finds themselves unappreciated by most of their own family on the inside. I have found that the client's predicament shows similarities to life experiences described in the Bible. In fact, it seems that four particular stories in the book of Genesis reflect the themes that flow through the client's life experience as recorded in your notes. The stories of Noah, Noah, Hagar, Leah, and Jacob. These particular stories in Genesis are all tied together by two motives. One is that all the main characters in these stories were dealing with affliction. The other one is that God is recorded to have seen their affliction and intervening in their affliction in a redemptive manner as a consequence of Him seeing them. First, it is Noah who, like your client, was in a social context in which his faith was not shared by others, except his family. Second, it is Hagar, who perhaps shares more with your client than the others in this list. She is also from an ethnic minority. She is stuck in an unfavorable predicament. She is characterized by acts of service. She is being used by those around her. She is pushed away and isolated. Third, it is Leah, who, like your client, was not loved by her husband. Finally, it is Jacob, who, like your client, was treated unjustly and taken advantage of. I have found that in all the cases described, instilled hope is what made the difference. In all these stories, hope was instilled by a divine promise, decree, or intervention. Also, in all these narratives, the divine promise, decree, or intervention was made in the context of a process that took time before the actual materialization of that promise. A process in which each biblical character mentioned was expected to be actively involved, as in a working alliance. Bridging the world of your client with the world of the scriptures, our research and clinical insights find their biblical contextualization most clearly in Hagar's story. Hagar's story is most complexly recorded and most resembling to that of your client. It is also one in which, even though not mentioned literally, the hope instilled by God's promise has created both rapport between the divine and human. Hagar names the divinity as the God who sees me, and motivated change in Hagar's renewed will to continue living, returning to Abraham's household, and persevering through her circumstances until the birth of Ishmael. Creating rapport through instilling hope stands at the heart of the counseling endeavor, starting from your client's motivation to see you and continuing with the working alliance between you and the client. The helping process feeds from an underlying sense of hope that things can and will get better. God's intervention in the situations of Noah, Hagar, Leah, and Jacob instilled hope not solely because of what God promised or decided to do, but also because, in the process, God created a working alliance with these people. Noah had to build the ark. Hagar had to obey God's direction of going back to her mistress. Leah had to continue persevering in her marriage, and Jacob needed to persevere in working for Laban. Even more, the scriptures do not merely record God as intervening in their affliction from a distance, but rather his intervention is directly related with him intimately seeing their affliction first. God noticed, validated, and cared for these people's lives, and he cares for the life of your client. We can reference here, in a contextualization to clinical practice, elements of positive psychology, in which the strengths of the client are in focus. Also, Egan's problem management and opportunity development model, in order to help your client form and achieve hopeful goals. Research shows that when the client is more confident in what their strengths are, they are also more likely to be more confident in making and pursuing the achievement of the goals they set. From the point of view of motivating change, I argue that the counterpart of the biblical divine promise in clinical counseling can be represented by De Shazer and Berg's miracle question of solution focused brief therapy. If through a miracle everything would be well tomorrow, how would that well look like? Of course, in the biblical narratives at hand, God knew how that well looked like and promised it. So for God, we cannot talk about a miracle question, but rather of a miracle promise. Although we as counselors cannot make such prophetic promises of wellness to our clients, we can motivate our clients to define for themselves how that miraculous wellness should look like and help them pursue it by setting achievable goals and strategies to attain those goals. Hope, we argue, is the gas that fuels this process. A mention should be made about why I chose to describe hope as truthful hope for this presentation. It is because we as counselors want to instill hope that is anchored in achievable goals, not idealistic utopias. In the words of Krugman, hope is the elevating feeling we experience when we see, in the mind's eye, a path to a better future. Hope acknowledges the significant obstacles and deep pitfalls along the path. True hope has no room for delusion. End quote. This truthful hope can be accomplished not only through reanalyzing the surrounding circumstances of the client and the client's strengths in managing them, but also, and perhaps starting from, reanalyzing the theological perspective of the client on God, themselves, and their life. And one way of doing this, I would like to suggest, is through interactive storytelling. Thank you for listening to my presentation, Jake.